Thank you, Barry, for leading us in song, and Eric for your leading our prayer. We appreciate it very much. We're delighted that you're with us tonight. We have visitors with us. We're always blessed when visitors come our way, and several of you have been here during this time of the pandemic, or whatever you want to call it, because lots of congregations are not having services except on Sunday morning. We've been blessed to be able to continue most of the time. I was talking to a fellow on the phone just before I came to church and asking him about some things, and he said, well, just wanted you to know that we've been worshiping with you folks on Sunday night for a long time. And they meet on Sunday morning, clean the building later, and then meet on Wednesday night, and then clean the building again and do all of that, and are hoping to get started back. But I said, well, we appreciate your watching and listening and being a part of our services, and we are honored that several are watching the live stream of this service tonight and our other services too. And we are thankful that we have the opportunity to provide that service. But maybe before long, everything will be back to normal. The brethren at Montrose I got their bulletin today, and they have several that are suffering with the coronavirus. And Brother Roger Draper, I understand, as R.W. was telling me, he had learned that he has been very ill with it. So let's remember all of these people and be aware of the suffering that's going on around us. It seems like some people have a really difficult time with it, and other people just breeze through it. But that's the way it's been. When our family had the mumps years ago, my grandmother waited on every one of us, took care of all of us, and she'd never had the mumps and died not having the mumps. But she took care of all of us, and they said that they all were feeling badly and poorly except me, and I was swollen swollen and all of that, but I'd run from this bed and jump in this bed and jump in another bed. I don't even remember it. But I suppose that's the way it is with many different types of illnesses. But we need to be concerned and pray for all of those who are going through those problems. The book of John. Great book, of course, because it's a book in the Bible. It's the inspired, inerrant Word of God, and therefore it is important that we read it and study it and believe it and put into practice the things that we learn from it. We have talked about the synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are identified in that way to distinguish them from John, which is written in an entirely different way, from a different perspective, for maybe other purposes. Of course, all were written to reveal the will of God. And all four books serves as biographies of our Lord. But John is far different. It's generally agreed that John was written later than the other three. And I read one writer who described John as a type of commentator on the other three, adding things that they did not include and approaching the life of Christ from an entirely different perspective. Andrew transferred to Freed-Hardeman this year and is down there presently. And one of the first things I asked him about was, what classes are you taking? And he immediately said, well, my Bible class is the life of Christ. I said, well, how about that? That's what I studied the first semester I was at Freed-Hardeman in the summer of 1965. And that class started about, I believe it was about 7 o'clock and lasted for 2 hours. and you yawned a little every once in a while, that early in the morning. But the teacher was sleepy too, you could tell. But we had a good class, and that was my introduction to a college Bible class. But John is accepted, or it's almost also accepted by most, that John did not depend on the other accounts for his. There are those who believe that Mark got his information from Peter, and maybe Matthew relied on someone else or whatever, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke are, I guess you could say, interrelated in that they have so much of the same information. But it would be expected that all of the accounts would include certain material that would be redundant. For example, all four writers make observations about John the Baptist and his work. The feeding of the 5,000 is included in all four accounts. The triumphal entry is also covered by all of them. The Last Supper, the Passion of the Lord, the suffering and agony in the garden. And all of the writers mention a temple cleansing, a cleansing of the temple. But some place it at different times in the life of Christ, the ministry of Christ. Some believe that, the skeptics believe that there's a contradiction. But the explanation could be, and very well is, that there was a cleansing at the beginning of Jesus' ministry and a cleansing near the end of his ministry. And that would resolve that issue. But John's work is very distinctive and unique, as we mentioned last time. Let's look at some material that John omits, which is included in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. First of all, there is the virgin birth. He doesn't say anything about the virgin birth. He doesn't begin with the birth of Christ. He goes back beyond that, doesn't he? He doesn't picture Jesus as one that was born of a woman who was a virgin, but he goes back to the beginning and points out that Jesus was in the beginning with God, and he was God, and he was made flesh. And so that is a very different way of starting the book. Matthew and Luke both give a ancestry, a line of descent, but John doesn't really do that. He starts out with the fact that Jesus is the Son of God and he is eternal. You know, he doesn't emphasize the physical birth. John omits Jesus' temptation. That was a very significant event in the life of Christ. We read about it in the other accounts, but John does not really mention that. Nor does he mention Jesus' transfiguration. That was a very momentous occasion. And John, if indeed, as we'll talk a little bit more later about, John wrote the book. His name is not attached to it except in the Bible because it's just understood by most Bible commentators and so on, and it's been of long standing that John wrote this epistle. We have information from people who lived in close proximity to John, and they tell us that John the Apostle wrote the book. Polycarp and others talk about his doing that. We might have time to give you more information about that. But John was at the Transfiguration. Peter, James, and John, the inner circle. But he does not mention it. Nor does he reveal the institution of the Lord's Supper. That's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He doesn't. Why doesn't he mention that? I don't know. But he emphasizes another event that occurred at the same time, and that is the washing of the disciples' feet, and teaching us what real service is all about. Willing to do the menial task of a servant. He's teaching us a great object lesson about service and being a servant in his kingdom. John doesn't talk about the casting out of demons. And that's sort of unusual, isn't it? Because so many of the miracles of Jesus involve that. There are none of the long narrative parables that you find in the other accounts. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all call attention to many of Jesus' parables. John has Jesus and the disciples in Gethsemane, but he doesn't give any details about Jesus' agony during that time. The baptism of Jesus and the calling of the disciples are implied. We can draw inferences from what is said, but they are not covered events as they are by the other three. John only mentions the kingdom or uses kingdom terminology in John chapter 3 and again in John 18. Now, Matthew and Mark and Luke refer to the kingdom a lot, but John doesn't use that terminology much at all, and that stands out. John includes some material, however, that's not found in any of the others. And it's interesting to look at some of these things. The first 18 verses of the book is called the prologue. And it is an entirely different introduction to the life of Christ than Matthew, Mark, or Luke write. And those 18 verses really serve as the foundation of the book. It's sort of like a statement that a college teacher will give, at the first class session. Here's what you can expect. And he will lay out the program of study and the primary thoughts that you'll be pursuing. And that's what happens in those first 18 verses. He also tells us about the miracle at Cana in Galilee in John chapter 2, the turning the water to wine. Those first 11 verses of chapter 2 describe that event, but none of the other writers cover it. Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus in chapter 3 isn't covered by anybody else. Only John tells us about that. Same is true with the meeting of with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. Remember, the disciples thought it strange that Jesus was talking, first of all, probably to a woman, and secondly, that she was a Samaritan, because that was just a no-no in those days. But you'll find that Jesus had many who came out to see him as a result of that encounter. And he would say such things as, we must needs go through Samaria. And later on, after the church is established, the gospel is taken to the Samaritans. And so Jesus had laid the groundwork for that event. The healing of the lame man in chapter 5. You can almost just take it chapter by chapter and find something that isn't found in the others. But the entire 5th chapter basically is devoted to the healing of the lame man. And then there was the healing in chapter 9 of the man born blind. Some of the others talk about his healing the blind, but this was a case of a man who was born blind, been blind all of his life, and there would be no way that anybody could say, well, his sight just was gone temporarily and it returned. So this is no great miracle. It was a tremendous miracle that would be utilized to prove the deity of Jesus. The raising of Lazarus, one of my favorite stories, because it shows the human side of Jesus as well as the divine side. The power that he had to know what was going on with Lazarus. He was sick, but he purposely delayed going there, that Lazarus might die, so that he might raise him from the dead and make a tremendous statement concerning who he was and what he had the power and the ability to do. And then you see the tenderness with which he views this family. They evidently had been very kind and hospitable to Jesus. And now it's his turn to return the favor. People often ask, why did Jesus weep? Well, I think the most logical reason is that he had sympathy towards and empathy with people. Some have even suggested that he may have wept because he realized that he had brought Lazarus back to life only for him to have to die again. So there's just so many things to think about in that chapter. And one of my favorite statements, I've used at funerals on occasion. There's a statement to the effect that they're all mourning. Friends, family members, no doubt, are gathered together. They're all mourning just like we do today when we lose a loved one. And then suddenly there's this statement, when Jesus came. When Jesus came, everything changed. Weeping gave way to rejoicing. Death gave way to life. So many great, great lessons can be learned from that particular incident. And then you will find extended discourses by Jesus. I mean, we have that in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. But he will make a point, or there will be a miracle. I believe, did you have the lesson on the 7 signs of John, or in John? The 7 primary events that establish beyond any shadow of a doubt that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah. And John, in beautiful cadence, goes from one to the other, and as you proceed through the book, you come to the end, he'll say, now, Jesus did many other things that are not recorded in this book. And that seems to say there are some other books that you can consult and get additional information. That would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So that may be an implied reference to the other accounts, because John no doubt wrote later. Lest I forget to mention this, there are many Bible scholars and commentators who believe that John was the youngest of the apostles, that he was a very young man when Jesus chose him, called him, he and his brother James, to follow him. And then he lived until near the end of the 1st century. So he had a long life, and probably wrote this book later in life. But you can find some of those discourses in chapter 6, verses 26 through 71 is one of those long discourses. And then in chapter 8, verses 12 through 59, John chapter 10, you'll find one as well. But he also includes something that the others do not include, and that is the private discourses that he had with the 12, with the disciples, the 12, as we call them, apostles, disciples, those that were chosen by him. Do you realize that beginning in John 14, verse 1, and continuing through chapter 17, verse 26, that entire section is devoted to what Jesus wanted the apostles to know. Promise concerning the guidance of the Holy Spirit who would come upon them, guide them into all truth, and all of that. All of those promises are given. He's reassuring them. He tries to prepare them for the persecution that would be coming. And surely he did, because they endured it very patiently and faithfully. John being exiled to Patmos, and others, James being killed very early by Herod Agrippa, and that would have been in the early 40s, maybe 10 years thereabouts after the establishment of the church. And so they would suffer tremendously. Another thing about John's work is that he emphasizes the work of Jesus in Judea and Samaria much more than his work in Galilee. Now, when you read the other accounts, you'll find a lot of time is given to covering the events that happened in Galilee. But John looks more at the things that happened in Judea, or Judah, and Samaria. But who was this John? Who is the author of the book? Now, you might think that this is not important, but critics will always do what they can to destroy the Bible. They will question the writings of the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy has been maligned and attacked for generations and generations. And they try to make it appear that it is a conglomeration of different writers by different writers and all of that. One of the best refutations of that is the fact that when Jesus was tempted by Satan, what book did he quote? Book of Deuteronomy. He quoted Deuteronomy. All three passages that Jesus used to refute the devil's temptations came from the book that is now attacked as being less than genuine. Always remember that. Do you think the devil would not have known if Moses did not write Deuteronomy, and if he had known that it was not authentic? How do you think he would have responded to Jesus quoting Deuteronomy? Well, it's very likely he would have said, you're quoting that old book that, everybody knows is not right. It's not authentic. No, the book of Deuteronomy did the number on the devil. He left Jesus and went his way. Left him for a season. That doesn't mean he didn't return. But the Word of God will put to flight Satan and evil men. You might be familiar with B.F. Westcott. I know that he is a really well-known biblical scholar. And he is quoted by Brother David Lipe. And here is his statement that Brother Lipe refers to in his commentary on the book of John. He says that the writer of this book was, quote, a Jew of Palestine, an eyewitness, an apostle, and last of all, St. John, the son of Zebedee. End of quote. Now, look at those in succession. Was the writer a Jew? Well, there's a lot of reasons to believe that he is, because the writer talks about a lot of the Jewish customs and opinions of the day. And it's important to note these as you read through the book of John. He expressed current ideas about the Messiah. He describes the custom of the marriage and wedding feasts, as in John 2. The estimate of women in chapter 4, his dealings with the Samaritan woman. Look at how the disciples said, hey, don't you realize that you're not supposed to do this? That's exactly the view that Jewish men took toward women, and Samaritan women in particular. Then there's the belief in the transmission of sin. Who did sin, this man or his parents? Remember that question? That was very common in Jewish circles in that day. The hostility between the Jews and the Samaritans. Again, the Jews' view of the woman at the well. The Jewish view was being expressed by the disciples. The importance of rabbinic schools where the rabbis taught is mentioned in 7:15. And we have established this, of course, from the study of Matthew. The Pharisees' contempt for the common man is referred to in 7:49 and maybe other references throughout the book of John. The Pharisees looked down on other people. I mean, they just, if you weren't a Pharisee, you weren't anybody in their mind. And they were very, very self-righteous. So it's evident that a Jew is writing. A Jew of Palestine, well, he had very precise knowledge of Jewish observances such as purification, the significance of the Sabbath, the requirements of the law of Moses about testimony, 2 or 3 witnesses, all of that, burial customs, Jewish feasts. He talks about those in the book of John over and over and over again. The style of the book is Jewish, with what is called parallelism, characteristic of Hebrew writers, and the images that are portrayed. Remember the lamb, the brazen serpent, the living water, the manna, the shepherd, the vine. All of those harken back to the Old Testament. It's clear that the writer knew that the Old Testament to the Jews was the source of religious life. As early as chapter 4 to the Samaritan woman, he says salvation is from the Jews. He mentions Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, the father of the faithful. The brazen serpent mentioned in 3:14, the manna mentioned in 6:32, the water from the rock mentioned in 7:37, the pillar of fire in chapter 8, verse 12, and of course the Passover lamb in chapter 19, verse 36. All of those things applied to Jesus. And so many times in this book, as you read it, be thinking about this. This was done. Jesus did this that the Scriptures might be fulfilled. The Old Testament Scriptures are being fulfilled, and that's emphasized in the book of John over and over again. I could cite you a bunch of passages, but you probably are not writing those down. It'd be hard to write them down as quickly because I've given them out, and I apologize for that. The author also alludes to a lot of the topography. You know, we have maps of the topography of a certain area. Well, the book of John talks about several things that would have been familiar to a Palestinian Jew. For example, these are just little details, but they're interesting and they're significant. He talks about Bethany, but he doesn't just say Bethany. He says Bethany beyond Jordan, the other side of the Jordan. Some of the other writers don't do that. They just mention Bethany. Well, which Bethany are you talking about? John says Bethany beyond the Jordan. There was a Bethany that is said to be near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, in chapter 11, verse 18. Cana of Galilee is not mentioned by any other writer, as we mentioned earlier. John is said to be baptizing in Enon near to Salem. For what reason? What? Much water. I mean, that's just one of those little details. John was baptizing in Enon near to Salem because there was much water there. It's scriptural to emphasize that baptism involves much water. It involves enough water for people to be buried, because baptism is a burial. It's not sprinkling or pouring. Those are different Greek terms and different English terms. So that little statement is very significant. Sychar is said to be a city of Samaria. Now listen to this. Near the parcel of ground Jacob gave to Joseph, and Jacob's well was there. Look at those little details. That connects the book of John with Joseph and the parcel of ground given to him by his father. And then that well was there. That takes you all the way back to Jacob in the Old Testament, and when those wells were dug, and there were some people that filled them up, and they had to be redug. I've preached a sermon, and I'm sure others of you may have too, redigging the wells. They'd been filled up, so they had to be redug, and we need to redig the wells. Jacob's well also is described as being deep. Not a shallow well, it was deep. Ephraim was said to be located near the wilderness in chapter 11, verse 54. The author was also very familiar with Jerusalem. He knew about the temple. Talks about that in 2:14 through 20. He mentions the sheep gate and the pool called Bethesda, which had 5 porches or porticos. Notice those details. And then he was also familiar with the pool of Siloam, which translated meant sent. He includes that in chapter 9. And he mentions Solomon's porch on the Temple Mount, where Jesus walked during the winter. Chapter 10, verse 23. Now, I've emphasized some of the things that we just sometimes read over casually, and we don't think that much about it. But look at how detailed. And this information is historically accurate. So that's another reason why we believe the Bible to be from God, because of its accuracy. We appreciate very much your good attention. I heard both bells tonight, and I don't even have my hearing aids on. I told you.